Thank you. Right. The Pedagogy of Global Disorder, or there is no textbook for this, was the first thing that I thought of when I was invited to this workshop. And largely I thought my mind went to the classroom because, well, that's just the sort of scholar that I ended up being. Right? The first thing that I think of when I see something new out in the world or I read a new thing is how can I teach this? How can I incorporate this into the classes that I teach? For better or for worse, that's where my mind goes. So, just talking with Rachel a little bit earlier, she's putting together her first ever syllabus. How would you teach, a first year class on the global, the grand split? What would a grand split syllabus look like? It's a pretty difficult question to answer. And just considering the sheer volume of content that we've been faced with over the last 6 hours, it's remarkable. It is dizzying, and it goes beyond probably the scope of what any one well-informed IR scholar or comparativist, or anybody else for that matter, could possibly do. About 8 years ago, when I started teaching first-year courses, I was asked to teach your standard Intro to Global Politics course, and my mind went to debates at the time, towards the end of the Obama presidency, about the future of the liberal international order. And early on in that term that I taught it, Obama delivered his last State of the Union address where he said, I don't know if you remember, when there's trouble out in the world doesn't call China or Russia, they call us. And the joint, audience in the Senate give big standing ovation. And I'm like, yeah, that's that. Wow, the liberal international order. Yeah, John Eikenberry was right. Yeah, right. Well, that kind of theme morphed as the years went by when he who shall not be named was elected president. And the theme of the class became the crisis in the liberal order, to something these days, the world politics in an age of disorder, which shares many of the sort of atmospherics of the grand split, that there's something big going on. We don't really know exactly what it is that is going on, but perhaps if we put our heads together, we could probably get at some of it. In any event, my instincts remain the same about thinking about how do I teach this kind of stuff, and I have all sorts of ideas pinging around in my head after listening to everybody here. Now, the how can I teach it, this instinct, I think applies to other parts of the curriculum as well, right? How does this grand split, this great split, interact with the typical IR theory class at the second year level, right? If we're also facing a great split in theory, how does this affect all of the isms that populate our textbooks and sometimes pollute our minds as we think about world politics, right? How does it affect the upper year seminar on specialized topics, right? Graduate courses in IR and comparative politics and beyond. And so I want to talk about the pedagogy of the grand split. Now, if the mandate of these sessions here is to, quote, rethink and reconceptualize our approaches to the new environment of international relations, then the classroom needs to be a part of the story. And to develop that idea, I want to make 5 points. And the first one is just that, right? That the pedagogy of the grand split matters. Take some of the common patterns of speech that you hear or read about in all sorts of discourses on global order, right? You will hear things about, the ontological and the epistemological and the methodological and the normative and the political elements of this, that, or the other. Now, if we are to treat scholarly knowledge about world politics as a paradigm in that kind of loosey-goosey Kuhnian sense, then the pedagogical elements must also be considered, because this is how we make sense of the world to students who will grow up and then go on to try and make sense of it for their own students, right? So this idea of incorporating the pedagogical constructs into our understanding of a grand split has considerable implications from the earliest undergraduate levels all the way up to PhD defenses. And yet, this pedagogical dimension rarely gets any love. In fact, it is very often sidelined in conversations about the field, about IR, its discipline, and so on. And that can have some really negative implications, right? Some bad habits set in, right? it doesn't matter where you are in your life or career, in this room, you've sat in an IR classroom and been taught something that's wrong, right? That's probably been corrected over the years, right? Now, the two kind of archetypes within international relations and its historiography are the myths of 1648 and 1919, right? That the Treaty of Westphalia created states because all of a sudden overnight there were countries, right? That's how it happened, yeah. Or that the IR discipline, poof, emerged out of 1919, right? Now these bad habits, implant themselves into the way we reproduce knowledge throughout the classroom, and as I said earlier, pollutes the minds of students who learn wrong things and then carry it with them all along the way. Now, it's not necessarily always that dire, but once things get institutionalized, there's a path dependency. And when you institutionalize knowledge about world politics into a syllabus, it becomes very difficult to change. A couple of years ago, Laura and I did an audit of how this department, the political science department here, taught second-year IR theory and second-year political economy. And basically, between 2006 and let's say 2021, it didn't change at all. Right, now think of all of the things that happened between 2006 and about 2021, and it didn't make it into any of the syllabi that we explored. And that's quite remarkable. So from a teacher's perspective, from a teaching perspective, I'm reminded of a line from Jonathan Zimmerman, who's an historian of university education in the United States. He says, quote, "College teaching is a highly public act that has remained mostly private. Our scholarship is a professional enterprise resting on peer review and other long-standing collective practices, but when it comes to teaching, we're solo operators. We're flying by the seat of our pants. We are amateurs." So, the professionalism that we see in the published disciplines of international relations, political economy, the kind of stuff that we're dealing with in here is vastly underdeveloped in the pedagogical world. Because for the most part, when you go into the classroom as an instructor or as a TA, you're by and large by yourself. Now, can we teach a pedagogy of the grand split? The answer to me is yes, but it requires something different than has been customary in Western IR pedagogy. And that is a vast, vast expansion of the remit of what counts in the study of world politics. Now, based on everything we have heard here, the state of the world is probably more complex and interconnected than maybe at any point in human history. Maybe. Now, taking that into a classroom would push the limits of what is ordinarily expected of an instructor standing in front of the classroom, and almost unreasonably so. I mean, think of what would be required to teach a pedagogy of the grand split. Just based on what we have heard today, it is mind-blowing. Right? Think about it, like the rise of the South, we heard, redefining core parts of our political vocabulary, of sovereignty. Right? From Laura talking about global value chains in the North American context, Africa-China relations, power transition theory, US-China relations. Right? If Fiona was here, we would have heard about authoritarian nationalist misogyny, geo-ontological challenges, right? The UNHCR regime. Who here among us can claim any reasonable a basis of knowledge in which to speak about that to an audience of students? The answer is, well, only the polymath. And if you're a polymath, fantastic, great. You're welcome to leave. But for the most of us, getting to this point requires a lifetime of learning. And because there's no textbook for this, the classroom instructor is alone. My second point is that just because there's no textbook doesn't mean there isn't any help. Right? There are ways of doing this, and doing this in a kind of a theoretically informed manner. And so here I want to promote a new kind of program that's been going on in international relations discourse called Global IR, Global International Relations, which I think can be used as a framework for a pedagogy of the grand split and all that might come after. Now, the Global IR program came out of Amitav Acharya's ISA presidential address about 10 years ago and has developed into a pretty rich research program. Now, its purpose is to rectify the shortcomings of largely Western IR theory by aspiring to, quote, greater inclusiveness and diversity in our discipline. And it has 6 basic features. I'm not going to read them all out, but just hit on a couple of them that I think are the most interesting and most important. Right? 1, it is founded upon world history, not just European history or Greco-Roman history or American history, but a world history that incorporates all sorts of parts of the world that we have heard about in this session and those that we have not. Right? It integrates the study of regions and regionalisms at those levels of analysis that we have touched upon here, but are often, elided when we speak to early undergraduate students. Right? Recognizing multiple forms of agency and local constructions of order that get at the nitty-gritty and the details of parts of the world that, again, are often overlooked when we talk about great power politics. So, let me put this into more practical terms for you, if you are so inspired to try and teach a global IR-informed undergraduate survey course. Right? It should, at a minimum, be able to compare and contrast multiple civilizational histories and traditions of international thought. Check, easy peasy. Integrate non-Western intellectual traditions into the parade of IR isms, while keeping up to date on the doings and transpirings of mainstream IR theories. Integrate empirical developments at multiple levels of analysis. Integrate empirical development of local actors in far-flung places, all while avoiding exceptionalism and the pull of any one civilizational reference point. Now, and as a bonus, keep up with developments on scholarship in other languages that are not your first. I have a hard enough time with English, so I am out. Point number 3, this is extraordinarily difficult. Right? If you are brave enough to try it, Godspeed. As much as we talk about collaboration in the university system, teaching is largely something that you're going to end up doing on your own. Now, there may be moments of collaboration and convergence which are fantastic, but for the most part, this is a very, very, very steep hill to climb. It basically expects the instructor to be sufficiently conversant in knowledge from all around the world and be comfortable enough to teach on the matter in a way that doesn't oversimplify, that doesn't corrupt knowledge, that doesn't make the kinds of mistakes that are often reproduced in IR theory classes and have been for a very, very long time. Now, I'll skip that. Point number 4. A pedagogy of the grand split does not have to be limited to the outer perimeter of what the instructor knows. There are all sorts of interesting theoretical and technical pedagogical devices that can be used in order to prevent what the professor knows from restricting what goes on in the classroom. We can talk about that kind of stuff in a question and answer period. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move forward. The 5th point here is the why does this matter in a broader sense. I think there are 2 very useful reasons for why this matters, intellectual and political. Politically, there are all sorts of pressures on us as departments, as educators, as people in the university to be more representative of the societies that we serve, and I think that's great. Teaching a GIR, a global international relations of the grand split, has the promise of meeting all sorts of demands for diversity and inclusion and all that kind of stuff in ways that are intellectually robust. Now, there are 2 ways to take it. Like, the first is the kind of EDI, progressive leftist approach that has become a lightning rod. And the second one is the one that I find more interesting and more exciting. And it's that it makes what we do as students of world politics far more interesting. Right? Think. Like, most of what constitutes international relations knowledge has been drawn from European history over the last 400 years. It doesn't disqualify it from being important and relevant, but what we have here is a sample size problem. Right? Generalizing about world politics based on events and thinkers that have lived on, as Huntington once called it, a small peninsula at the extremity of the Eurasian landmass, only for a couple of centuries, is quite limiting. Diversifying the intellectual remit of what we do has a way of making the inherited history of what we have studied so much more interesting. And it has the possibility to shape young minds in a much more expansive way that I think is extraordinary. So, I'll bring this home. A couple of weeks ago at the International Studies Association conference, I was struck by something someone said, which is that it takes about 20 years for any new theoretical development to make its way into a textbook. Right? 20 years between the emergence of an idea and where it is finally canonized in an IR standard textbook. That's pretty remarkable. So perhaps 20 years from now, there will be a chapter in Baylis, Smith, and Owens, The Grand Split, and that will explain to us what is going on right now, at which point children born right now would be taking that course, wondering why they're learning about ancient history. That thought takes me back to my first year of undergraduate in the fall of 2002, when I was starting things, and I had a textbook for a Mod West Civ class, back when those things were still taught, that devoted a half column on the very last page to the events of 9/11. And its conclusion was basically, well, we'll see what happens. And I think back to that 22 years later, in the midst of our conversations here about the great split, the grand split, that there is no textbook on this, at least not yet. But holy smokes, we're doing the best we can. Thank you very much.